Last night I made sure that the pointer was working right, checked the batteries, everything was working. Guess what? One of the batteries was in the wrong. I'm going to make an assumption that everybody can read. During the past few months, I've had a chance to do some thinking. Instead of getting lessons ready, could actually think about it a little bit and start thinking about what the Bible really did mean. I remember when I retired, I remember seeing a show on the History Channel pointing out some of the more important things that have influenced Western civilization during the last few centuries, during the last, 2,000 years. And this was at the time that I was leaving my profession of chemistry. And I can tell you that, truthfully, I haven't done a thing in chemistry since 1994. Simply because that particular list listed the Bible as probably being the most influential thing that has hit the Western civilization in the last 2,000 years in terms of how it influenced so many things that we have in our history. And it started me thinking a little bit about the Bible. Now, I'm going to go through some stuff today. Originally, the title of this lesson would have been an objective view of the Bible, but I didn't think I was going to. But I want to give you a little bit of an objective view of the Bible by showing you a few slides of some things that you are already familiar with. This is going to be about Bible and secular history. Now, this is some data that I'm sure you're already familiar with. It's probably the most printed book in the Western society. There may be more copies of some of the Chinese stuff printed and maybe the Quran, but certainly as far as the Bible, they estimate 5 billion copies of the Bible have been printed at some time, and it is still one of the best-selling books in the world. It has been translated into 704 different languages. We have a Bible, the English Bible, and our English Bible generally will consist of 39 chapters in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. And our Bible is very similar in some ways to the Hebrew Bible in that, maybe I should call this an English Protestant Bible, in that our Old Testament is almost identical to the Hebrew Old Testament. One of the interesting things that I found about this thing is that there are a lot of additions to the English Bible, and some of them will vary a little bit. I know I ran into, that wasn't always English because of a different language. I remember one time when my colleague, Al Bergstaller, who was brought up as Roman Catholic, was trying to find something in the Bible, and he was using one of our Protestant Bibles. Well, it turned out he was looking for something that was in the Vulgate, which was the Catholic Bible, which has chapters, has books that we don't have. I found some other things that in other languages, for example, if you take a look at the Quran or the Muslim Old Testament, very similar to ours, except one place. When Abraham takes Isaac up on the mountain to be sacrificed, he doesn't take Isaac, he takes Ishmael. Why? Well, Ishmael was the father of the Arabs. Another one I found interesting is the Samaritan Bible. The Samaritan Bible, again, is similar to ours, but the people don't worship in Jerusalem in the Samaritan Bible. They worship at Mount Gerizim because that was the sacred mountain. Those are very small differences. They're not all that significant. Our New Testament, well, I don't want to say that much about it because most people know quite a bit about it. I'm just going to say a few things in general, and that is that we know a lot about the New Testament simply because it fits in a very small time frame, from about 7 BC until about 95 AD. About 100 years, and it all takes place in about the same area. I think I do have the map showing the area. It takes place in the Mediterranean area, in the European side of the Mediterranean, European and Asian side, and a little bit in Palestine, where you see Lebanon right now, actually in the area that we call the Levant. There are no indications that I could find that Jesus ever got out of the Levant other than up into Tyre and Sidon. And when you get to the Acts of the Apostles, The apostles go all over the place in the Mediterranean, but very little indication that they go anywhere to the east. They don't seem to go into Mesopotamia. And also we find that the New Testament is very well documented in that it is taking place during a period where the Roman Empire was in control of Palestine and a better part of the world at that time, and extensive manuscript and extensive writing had been done to talk about the history at that particular time. Now that's really not the case with the Old Testament. I also want to mention something else, and that is that when Jesus started his ministry, it sounded different from the Old Testament. People immediately questioned, what are you doing? And this is what Jesus' answer was. This is from the Sermon on the Mount. I think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them. That in itself is enough to suggest maybe we better take a look at what the Old Testament does have to say. There must be something that is of pertinence there. Now, the Old Testament is a little bit different in that it is given to us in an interesting fashion. Most of the Old Testament consists of what you see here, biblical history, some commentary on biblical history. By commentary, I mean things like the Psalms and the oracles of the prophets, etc., and a lot of cultic material. That is things that pertain to the temple, that pertain to the synagogue, that pertain to the festivals that were part of the the Israelite customs at that time. The other thing that's interesting about the Old Testament is it's divided into two parts. I don't know if I have a slide for this. The first part runs from chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 11, verse 10. All of about, I think, 4 pages or 10 chapters. It covers a period of approximately 13 billion years up to 100 or 1700 BCE. The second part runs from about 1700 BC all the way to about 400 BC, which is about 1300 years. And in my copy of the Bible, it ran 1,004 pages. The reason being that the first part that of Genesis deals with something that's very different from the rest of the Old Testament. It deals with a relationship that God had with mankind from the very beginning. I hope these slides are up there now. Genesis 1, for example, as a matter of fact, it's kind of interesting. It is the newest part of the Old Testament. It's the last book that actually was written in terms of the Old Testament, probably written about 400 or 500 BC. And it covers from the time of the Big Bang, which is estimated at about 13.8 billion years. We may be off by a few billion years, but don't worry too much about it. And it takes all the way up to, I'll say the first book of the first chapter of Genesis, all the way up to the situation in which the earth is formed, life forms on the earth, Homo sapiens come on the scene as the ultimate of the life processes. And I also added here that man himself, as far as archaeologists are concerned, didn't really show up in Europe until maybe about 50,000 BC. Prior to that, he was in Africa. Very quickly, let's look what's in those first chapters. After the creation story, we have some legends. The Adam and Eve legend. Next, the Cain and Abel legend. These are the first couple of chapters, 2 and 3, I think, of Genesis. Then we have a very strange part of the Bible that I've never talked about here, and that is that we have a time when we have Enoch showing up on the scene, the time in which we have the fallen angels show up on the scene, the time in which we have the Nephilim showing up on the scene. The one thing that you may remember about Enoch is that he walked with God and he was no more. He was taken up into heaven. And as far as the fallen angels, what we are told is that they caused an awful lot of problem. That led to excessive sin in the world at that time. The Nephilim were the process here. That led to what? That led to Noah. That led to God calling on Noah to build an ark. He builds this ark to be able to preserve all of the living creatures on the earth, including mankind. Here we have a picture of the ark. Again, everybody's familiar with these stories. I do want to mention, however, that what is mentioned rather prominently at the end of the story of the ark is the mention of his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And there's a good reason for that. And that is because, according to the legend, and this starts to show up in chapter 11 of Genesis, the people decided that they had multiplied enough that they could attain God. And one way of attaining God would be what? Build a tower up to God. And that's when they built this Tower of Babel. And that was decided not to have been a good idea. And that's when God did what? Change the language situation. Now, historically, one of the things that we do know is this, and that is that the languages of the people were suddenly changed in an interesting fashion. They were sexualized. There was a group that lived in the period that I showed, the portion I show you there called the Semitic group, or the Semites, people that lived in Mesopotamia, that lived in the area between the Tigris and Euphrates River. Then off to the other side, you have the Hamites, the people in Egypt, the Africans, and others are all delegated to the to Japheth, or they're called a lot of different things, a lot of different languages. These are all based on language differences. And if I knew enough about it, I wouldn't even say this much about it. I haven't got the faintest idea about language in that regard. Maybe if you had a professional linguist, they could point out why there are differences in these language patterns. The Europeans, for example, have language similarities to some of the people in India, interestingly enough. The Semites, or the Semitic people, have languages that you find in that particular part of the world. You want to notice something about this Hamites? I wish I had the pointer here. What's included among the Hamites, or the descendants of Ham? What's included in the descendants of Ham is Canaan, is the region of Canaan, where most of the Old Testament takes place. Actually, the Semites originated in Mesopotamia, but they end up in Canaan. We'll be making quite a bit of that later on. Like I said, the span in the Old Testament is really quite interesting, particularly in the fact that we find that in this book of Genesis, it also deals with span in an interesting fashion. And that is that we get to the Tower of Babel, and then the next verse in the same chapter starts talking about the family of Terah, of where Terah had come from. Terah had been a descendant of Shem, and then traced his history all the way down to the time that supposedly Terah was alive, and talk about his family, which included what? Abraham and Sarah and Lot and another son, Nahor, not mentioned there. A span of what? Approximately 10,000 years. 10,000 years of jumping from one verse to another verse. And what does the Bible have to say about what happened in that span of 10,000 years? Zero. It doesn't say anything at all. That brings up some rather interesting points that we'll discuss a little bit later. Most of the Bible in the Old Testament takes place in what is called the Fertile Crescent. You've heard this many times. It's the area that runs all the way from the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia, through that area of the Tigris and Euphrates River, all the way down through the Levant. Actually, in some of the maps, it takes you all the way into Egypt. This was the area in which agriculture could grow. This was the area in which people could raise crops. And a lot of the area, well, for example, the Arabian Desert was not very conducive to raising any produce of any sort. I want to just show you one interesting thing that I found looking at a world map here. If I had a pointer now, what I would be doing is pointing at the United States, and you see that little tip, not Florida, But the other tip coming down, that's Texas. And what do you know about Texas? The largest state that we have in our union. But on the whole map, what does it look like? You can hardly make out Texas all. I want to show you this next slide. Here is the area in which the Old Testament takes place with an overlay of Texas. And you find out there really wasn't very much land area that was involved in the Old Testament at all. There is a little bit more about Egypt than what we've shown just on this overlay with this bit of Texas. But it is kind of interesting. We're going to be talking about a period of time that runs all the way from about 1700 BC to about 400 BC. And it's all going to take place in a relatively small area of the total area of the world at that time. And yet it ends up in giving rise to what we said is one of the most important documents that we have in any language. This is the sort of thing that you will very often find in the Old Testament. I'm going to be talking more about that some other time. But it's going to be a whole long list of the people that were descended from Shem up to the time of Terah. Now, take a quick look at this once and realize we're talking about 10,000 years. Is this 10,000 years where there are things that are missing? There are a lot of things that are missing. But as far as the biblical writers were at that time, they wanted to show that Terah was actually a Semite. He was actually somebody that was a descendant from Seth. The funny thing that we find is that the first action that we see after 10,000 years, the first action that we see is from Terah, who has been in Mesopotamia, who has a heritage that goes back 10 millennia. And what is the first thing that we find that Terah says? We're going to move. We're going to move out of Mesopotamia. And that's exactly what happens in the next couple of verses. Terah takes Abraham and Sarah, Abraham's wife, and Lot, his nephew from another son, and they move to go to Canaan. Now, next week we'll talk a lot more about why Canaan was so important here. But right now what we're told is that what happened is as soon as they got to the northern part of Mesopotamia, I don't think it shows here, northern part of Mesopotamia in the region of Haran, Terah stopped and he didn't go any further. As a matter of fact, he never moved again. Abraham did. It says that after a period, Abraham looked out and said, I'm going to continue and go on into Canaan. And Abraham goes into Canaan. In the meantime, Terah and his family stay up in Haran. What is the significance of that? Well, it becomes very significant in later parts of the book of Genesis when we find out that of the 10 tribes, of the 12 tribes of Israel, they all have a head, and most of the ancestral heads were born, guess where? In Haran. They were not born in Canaan. They were born up in Haran. They were sons of Jacob when he was married to some girls that he had gotten to know through in the family that had stayed up there. You're all familiar with the fact that Jacob didn't flee his brother Esau, and went up to Europe and went up to Haran and spent a long time in Haran, where he had a family. He had 2 wives, 2 concubines, and 11 children before he moved down into Canaan. Most of those children were born in Haran. This is one of the reasons for keeping Haran as a part of the story very, very early in the book Genesis. But moving on a little bit, it's kind of an interesting thing to take a look at how man has been trying to study, or how mankind has been trying to study this Old Testament and trying to get some indication of what was there. And in order to do that, we have to know a little bit about the availability of the Old Testament. What we can read in the Old Testament is that Ezra, at around 400 BC, Ezra actually had gotten together the 5 books of Moses, what we call the Torah, or the books of law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then he actually read those 5 books during that period. There are other indications that a number of the other books called the prophets, for example, Samuel and Kings and Chronicles and some of these others, were all put together around 200 BC. And many of the other parts of the Old Testament were really not accumulated and brought together until after the birth of Christ, after Christ. And probably were canonized about 200 AD. About 200, not much, maybe a little bit later than that, but not much later than that. From 200 AD on, then people did have the Old Testament to refer to study, and to get some indication of what the Old Testament has to say, and to get some indication maybe of what Jesus meant when he said that he didn't come to abolish the material in the Old Testament, rather what? To fulfill it. What do you do with a situation when you have a Bible such as this one, like this book of Genesis? And in this book of Genesis, we have a span of about 10,000 years where absolutely nothing is said. Nothing is said at all. Well, there's one way of taking care of a problem like that. And say, if it's not there, it's not important. Have you ever heard of that attitude? Being an organic chemist, I'm very accustomed to the fact that most people do not know much about what I do, and guess what? They don't really care either. And that includes a lot of other chemists, because they don't know about it. If they don't know about it, don't pay any attention to it. One of the things that developed that was unfortunate with that attitude, which is a very human attitude, was the way they looked at what the Old Testament had to say. If it isn't there, it isn't important. But what is important? What is there? And what is there is inerrant. You see that word inerrant? If I had a pointer, I'd point it out. Inerrant means that, well, I think I have a definition. Inerrant means that it's incapable of being wrong. That what you have in the Old Testament is correct. Why? Because we said it is. It is correct. Don't question it. Don't even begin to question it. From the period of approximately the time of the beginning of the analyzing and criticizing the Bible at around 200 or 300 AD, up until about 1500 AD, the inerrant approach to the Bible was the one that prevailed. Either you believed the Bible to be totally true and capable of being an error, or you didn't believe in the Bible. Who was rather significant in seeing to it that people felt that way? The Roman Catholic Church. You follow that? I remember reading or hearing something very interesting about how easy it is to fall into these sort of situations. Say, if I don't understand it, it's not important. A good friend of mine when I was in graduate school was a Catholic. He and I used to talk an awful lot about the difference between our Calvinism and the Protestant church and Catholicism. And I told him about an interesting book I had read about a man who was being converted into Catholicism and approached a priest one time. And the priest said, "How have things come?" He says, "Very well, except I have a couple of questions." How do you explain the fact that the Pope was infallible? Oh, that priest said, "That's very simple. The Pope is infallible. What else is bothering you?" That was not an unusual. My friend got a kick out of that too. This is unfortunately true, that if you didn't understand it, you forgot about it and ignored it. And what could happen that became very serious is that things that probably were not true were taken as being true, and they were not true. What do you read about what do you see about the 1500s? The interpretation, well, this is what I said, the interpretation was from that period. This is the period of the Renaissance. What's another meaning for Renaissance? A rebirth. It was a rebirth of thinking. If we take a look at that period between 200 and 1500 BC, we go through a very strange time or section of what we have in terms of history. At that time, the Romans were still in power, but by 400 AD, the Romans were losing their power, and the Roman Empire was starting to crumble rather badly. And then it was followed by, well, they tell us a lot in what they're describing, the Dark Ages. And what do we know about the Dark Ages? Not very much. Not very much came out of the Dark Ages. But the church was there, and this interpretation of the Bible, the inerrant interpretation, was there. After the Dark Ages came in medieval ages, and it wasn't until about the 1500s that things started to change a bit, and people were trying to think in terms of the fact that maybe there is more to what is going on than what we are seeing right now. Now, many, many different things could be said about this, but from the 14th to the 17th century was the time of the discovery of classical literature and philosophy and a certain amount of art, and I think rather significant, the Reformation. We have John Calvin, and I think I have one here, Martin Luther too. I guess you got Martin Luther. Both of these came very early in the period of the Renaissance. I think Luther is around 1400 or 1514 or something like that, and John Calvin's a little bit later than that. Very early in the Renaissance, there was thinking going on in the realms of Christianity. What does that really all mean? That wasn't the only place where things were taking place that were very important. Could spend a lot of time talking about a lot of different areas, but one that's kind of interesting because historically it's so important is that in Poland there was a man, a Copernicus, an astronomer, who came up with the idea that the Earth circles around the sun, and it isn't the sun that circles around the Earth. It's called a heliocentric idea, namely that the planets, the observation of the planets, which people had been done from the very beginning of time, were more readily explained in terms of the planets going around the sun rather than the sun. Well, rather than the sun what? Well, you know what the Bible says. The sun rises and the sun sets. There's several instances I could give you where it says in the Bible that it is the sun that moves. The Roman Catholic Church at that time believed that wholeheartedly. And there was one man there that was not convinced of that, and that was Galileo. Galileo's a little bit later on, he's around the late 1600s. Galileo is often regarded as one of the fathers of modern science, developed certain aspects of the scientific method. He was also an astronomer, and he was also somebody that, because of his own observations, agreed with Copernicus that it is the Earth that moves around the sun, not the sun around the Earth. Well, how did the Catholic Church respond to it? They had an inquisition to make him recant what he had said, that he would recant it. Well, I think I have a picture of his recanting it. This is before the bishops in Rome, where he did recant, but as I was told that after the recantation, he was heard to mutter as he was leaving the room, "It still moves." No matter how much you want to change it, it still moves. Now, it wasn't just the situation of Galileo. It was with a lot of other things that happened during the Renaissance that led to another very significant period in terms of the history of man. Is the period of Enlightenment. This period of Enlightenment runs from, it's called Age of Enlightenment, and it starts around the 1700s through the 1800s. What do we find in that period? Well, I will bet you that you could go to many universities, you would find literally hundreds of PhD theses that have been spent studying the people that talked about the changes that came about because during this Age of Enlightenment, they rethought a lot of things. They rethought government. Do we rethink government? One of the important things that came out of this Age of Enlightenment was, guess what? The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. or parts of the period of Enlightenment. There are a lot of other things. I think I may have a little bit more about that on the next slide. It dealt with progress of liberty, toleration, fraternity, and I highlighted something else, the separation of church and state. That church and state ought to be thought a little bit more carefully. Already the Reformation has made it rather apparent that there are a lot of people that did not necessarily go along with everything that the Roman Catholic Church was doing or saying or made them to believe, but they ought to be doing some of that thinking of their own, on their own. And that led to a little bit of a change. Well, here again, there are a lot of people that got involved with this, but I'm only going to talk about one, and that was a guy named Spinoza. Now, I like to regard Spinoza as being a Dutch philosopher. Believe it or not, he was a Dutchman. He's generally regarded as being a Jewish philosopher, but actually he was about a fourth generation Jew living in Amsterdam and had been part of the persecution of the people in Spain and Portugal under Queen Isabella. Remember Isabella? She was the one that sent Columbus, a part of the Renaissance, when people were starting to ask, can the earth be round or could it be flat? Evidence of that. But Isabella also persecuted the Jews, and Spinoza and his family fled to the Netherlands where they found refuge. And Spinoza became, among other things, quite interested in what was in the Bible itself, and wrote a lot about that and about himself. Among the things that I read about Spinoza that got me thinking more about the guy was this. He felt strongly that he was a part of God's creation. Felt very strongly a part of it. And if God had created him with a mind, it was his responsibility to use it. And he said, I'm going to think about these things. Spinoza had a very interesting concept of the creation, a concept of God. I read somewhere else that at one point, at the time when Albert Einstein was regarded as one of the greatest thinkers that we had in the 20th century, was asked if he believed in God. And do you know what Einstein's reply was? I believe in the God of Spinoza. Because what did Spinoza believe? He believed that everything that he saw in creation was evidence of God. He did not like to make God look like a man. God was a spirit, was something different from that. And everything that you see in nature is a part of God. And the fact that all the laws of nature are obeyed always is evidence again of the fact that God is there. As a matter of fact, I found out that in one of the older hymns that we have in many of our church hymnals, it talks about the maintaining and ordaining thy kingdom divine. That's the prayer of thanksgiving. Guess where that came from? The Dutch. It's the Dutch prayer of thanksgiving. There were people that, at that time, when that hymn was written also, that recognized the same sort of things that Spinoza did, and that is that God was the creator of all and was the maintainer of all. And the fact that we have the creation and the fact that we find that everything, every law obeys the laws that were maintained by God are being followed. I would like to mention that here's a picture of Spinoza. He did anger a few people, and he got thrown out of the Jewish synagogue, and he also got thrown out of the Christian church. I don't know how he got in the church in the first place, but he was excommunicated from both. In the meantime, people would flock from all over Europe into Amsterdam to come to talk with this man Spinoza because of the things that he had to say. And Spinoza reached the ripe old age of 44, and he was gone. And he died. He was a lens grinder, and I think he died of the lens dust from the glass. But at any rate, this period of enlightenment, and with the people like Spinoza, making us think a little bit more about, hey, there are things that are in the Bible that we ought to know a little bit more about, led me to reach a conclusion, and that is that there is a period in the history of Bible criticism that is extremely important, and that is this period. Tell you about it. And that is the The 19th century, the period of about 1800 to about 1900, was a tremendous explosion in terms of critical examination of the Bible, largely in two areas. One of these areas is that during that period, and a rather significant period, during that period, people began to ask some questions. Just where did this Bible come from? This is a written word. Who wrote it? When did they write it? It didn't take long before people recognized rather quickly that there seemed to be many different authors. I think I read somewhere there may be as many as 37 different people that are involved in writing what we have in the Old Testament. Who wrote this? And how did they all get put together and put into the Bible? Well, first of all, looking at the problem of who wrote it led to what is called the documentary hypothesis. And if my slides were correct right now, we find out the hypothesis is nothing more than a suggestion of how one should look at things. The hypothesis is we should look at it from the standpoint that we have different authors that were writing at different times about different events that were part of the history of the people. And that all of these sources, these different sources, can be brought together and will lead to what we have in the Old Testament. This is the documentary, and it works very well, and because it worked so well, it was subjected to extreme criticism, but nobody has refuted it yet, and people still use the documentary hypothesis as a great means of trying to understand what was written in the Bible, who wrote it, when they wrote it, why they wrote it, and interestingly enough, what we find out is that when we read what they have, it reflects on themselves almost as much as the material, the times they're talking about. We learn a little bit about them from what they are writing. This was a very, very significant period, and in the next few months, I'm going to be talking an awful lot about the documentary hypothesis in some detail in terms of the things I just mentioned: who, what, when, and where, and why, and how they got right. And also some time on how this was all put together. I read somewhere, and I think I have to agree with this, that in some ways the putting together of the Old Testament from all these different sources is one of the evidences of some of the greatest literary geniuses that we have in all of history. And it seems to have worked. Remember that first slide, no matter how many copies of the Bible have been printed? It seems to have worked very well. But that wasn't the only thing. The other thing that developed during the 1800s was modern archaeology. Well, you say just a second, what's modern archaeology? Archaeology is a matter of looking at old things, and people are looking at old. Well, there was archaeology almost from the beginning of the first burial, because what did the first archaeologists involve themselves in doing? Grave robbing. People didn't pay much attention to anything except what was in the grave. But it was in the 1900s, actually by the time we get to the middle of the 1900s, that this became a rather significant thing to look at some of these old things and say, just a second, something was happening. Who were these people, and what does this mean? What do these artifacts that we have looked at here actually mean? These artifacts led to a series of things that we'll look at much more detail as we go on in the future, and led to taking that period of history all the way from the beginning and putting it into archaeological ages. It led to modern archaeology, where these observations were put into different periods of time. So follow me if you can. All the way from the beginning of time to about 10,000 BC is regarded as Paleolithic. Paleo means ancient stone, the ancient stone age. After about 9,000, actually around 8,000 BC, we get into what's called the Neolithic, or the New Stone Age. People were still using stone as a primary implement in their living. But one of the things that happened in the Neolithic age was the fact that, guess what? People started farming. People started to recognize that rather than have gathering from various places, There were certain places where things would grow, and they found that they could plant. The Neolithic Age led to the Pottery Age, where they found out that they could make pottery. Oh, they made pottery before that, but the thing that happened during the pottery period, which was around 5000 BC, was they learned how to bake clay so that it would be permanent and destroyed. And as a consequence, the archaeologists could actually find implements that were made and prepared as far back as 5000 BC. After that comes the Calcalithic Age. And the Calcalithic Age is one where man first started using metals. Calcal means copper, lithic means stone. It was a mixture of copper and stone in the Calcalithic Age. That was around 4000 BC. Around 3000, 4000 BC, people found that if they took copper and alloyed it with tin, they made bronze, which was much tougher. And then we have a period of about 3,000 years, which we call the Bronze Age. An early bronze, a late bronze, and guess what the other one's called? Middle bronze. The Bronze Age was a really very significant one because this allowed for the formation both of weapons of war, but weapons that could be used for other things as well, or materials that could be used for other things as well. It was during that early Bronze Age that they came up with another interesting idea. They started to teach themselves how to write, and to write down and to record things that were actually happening. This is when some parts of modern archaeology really became significant, because as we will talk about next week, the way they wrote would be to use a stylus in clay and put a little cone shape of the stylus on the clay and get a kind of writing that we call cuneiform. And guess what they would do with that clay? They would bake it, just like they bake their pottery. And consequently, those tablets that they were writing on were baked and they were preserved. And in the 1800s, we'll talk about this next week, in the 1800s, a man named Layard, for example, came across a library in what was the old city of Nineveh, came across the library that we call Ashurbanipal's library, where Ashurbanipal, one of the Assyrian emperors, took it upon himself to set up a library and to collect as many of these old tablets as he could. As I understand it, after Layard's discovery, the English did get control of that library, and most of it has been transported to Britain. And it consists of 20 to 30,000 different tablets. A lot of things are recorded. One of the important things that archaeologists had to do during the 1800s is to learn how to read that cuneiform language. And then from that language, guess what they were able to do? Form a history of the things that had actually occurred that we have in that 10,000 year period that we have nothing about in the Bible. It may very well be that if we learned a little bit more about the history of what happened in that period of 10,000 years, we can understand why Terah, when he suddenly shows up on the scene as the first participant in the new part of the Old Testament, says we're going to move from Mesopotamia and we're going to go to Canaan. But when we know something about the history, which we can learn from the archaeologists, which way they can learn from these tablets, then guess what? Then we're going to be able to learn a little about that history. That history can be regarded as secular history because it is not biblical history. Now, with the few minutes that I have left, I want to talk about two definitions. One of them is the word secular history, and the other is biblical history. They are not the same thing. Probably one of the easiest ways of looking at this is that biblical history, as we look at it in interpreting the Bible, deals with only those events that are recorded that relate to the things that involve the children of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, in their association with their God. Only the things that are associated with God are going to be recorded in biblical history. I mentioned all the biblical history that we had in the Old Testament. What is that all about? It's all about the Israelites and their relationship with their God. Biblical history in the New Testament, what is it about? It's about Jesus. It's about Paul. It's about their relationship with God. This is biblical history. I'll get to this in just a moment. Secular history is history that does not refer, it deals with the relating of events, but do not involve God in any way whatsoever. Or our God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and Jacob. It can involve foreign gods, it can involve Zeus and the Greek gods and all, but doesn't involve our God. That is secular history. And it's separated from biblical history. Is there a lot of secular? Oh yes, there's a lot of secular history. A lot of secular history. There's a lot of things that are in history, and we'll look at some of those next week, that don't involve the God of the Israelites whatsoever. But what about biblical history? Well, we have a lot of that in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. But there's something interesting about biblical history. And that is that all of these events that were taking place, that are recorded in biblical history, are taking place in a world where secular history is occurring at the same time. But there is absolutely no mention of any of the secular history in biblical history. There's no mention of secular history in the Old Testament. It's completely devoid of that whole period between the Tower of Babel and Tehran, 10,000 years. No mention of God. It's not going to be included as part of biblical history, and it did not show up in the Bible. Biblical history is kind of interesting in a way. And I thought of an exercise that people can put themselves through that is very similar to what must have been involved in writing biblical history. Imagine you are given the task right now of recording your family history in detail, only your family, from 1939 to 1945, and don't mention any of the battles of World War I. That's what biblical history is like. Could you do this? Yes, you could write a pretty good history of your family, of the marriages and the divorces, of the deaths, you could even refer to the fact that during that period you could only travel 35 miles an hour and you had gasoline rationing, and you could only buy. You're also probably great celebrations because apparently this war over in Europe is over, and you could even refer to the fact that, hey, that was kind of interesting. One bomb would put an end to it, all a part of your family history. But it doesn't talk about the Blitzkrieg or about the Battle of London or the landing of the troops in Europe or the European War, or does it talk about the bombing of Pearl Harbor? You don't put that in your family history. Those are dealing with life. That's the way biblical history was written. You don't talk about the things that are secular history. Why? They don't pertain to what biblical history is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about the relationship that man has with God. There's a very interesting thing, and I'll show you sometime later in the year. There's a period in the history of the Israelites, a period of approximately 609 BC to about 604 BC. In that period of 609 BC, one of their kings, Josiah, is killed. Well, he was considered a good king, and we get quite a bit about his killing and about his death. What we get is very little of the fact that the Egyptians were responsible for his death, and they took over the rule of Israel at that time. And the Israelites became vassals of Egypt in 609. In 605, all of a sudden we find out that the Israelites were no longer vassals of Egypt, they were vassals of Babylon. They didn't have to answer to the Egyptian king, they had to answer to the Babylonian king. That's 5 years. Well, what happened in that 5 years, in the year 605? There's one of the most important battles that was fought in that history of that whole period, the Battle of Carchemish, that took place up in the upper part of Haran. What happened in that Battle of Carchemish was that the Babylonians defeated the Egyptians and it drove the Egyptians out of Palestine, and the Egyptians did not have very much control of anything that was happening in Palestine, but the Babylonians did. How much of this shows up in the Old Testament? None of it. That's all secular history. That has nothing to do with the relationship of the people with that. Now, I want to qualify this a little bit, and that is that when we talk about history in this fashion, I'm talking about the history that is written or related to certain events. Is there history that is not written or related? Yes, there's still a lot of. Just because secular history, the written part, does not include the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this does not preclude God from being a part of history. You follow me? And what we find in the Bible, some rather interesting things that indicate that, yes, God was a part of history. As a matter of fact, we find that a very significant part of the history of the Jews was being freed from exile under the Babylonians because of Cyrus the great Persian emperor. The Cyrus the Great was the one who freed us. But one of the prophets says, speaking through God, Cyrus was referred to by God as what? My servant Cyrus. And that what Cyrus was doing was ordained by God. We can ask this question, is everything that is a part of history, even though it is not recorded in secular history as involving God, God may be involved? Can we preclude God from? Have any of you thought about this in the last day or so and watching what was happening 20 years ago and asked the question, is God a part of this history? Another very fascinating part of the Bible is the things that the Bible has to say about the fact that man is going to search for indications in the Old Testament and in the New Testament and in the writings and in the prophets and in the oracles and everything else, indications that God may be involved in certain parts of history. We'll get into some of that as well. There's an awful lot to the Bible that involves looking at the relationship of secular history and biblical history. Actually, none. But by inference, we can get it. By inference, we can say, this sort of thing that we're reading about as biblical history must have occurred at the same period that this secular history was taking place. All of a sudden, we find that the Bible is giving us a history of our religion, not in terms of some metaphysical things, but in terms of the history of man from the very beginning. And that our religion is based on historical fact, not some mystic, serialistic ideas of something coming from the heavens in a strange way, but a real earth, a real history, and that God may very well have been a part of it. And part of one of the reasons that this very day, literally throughout the world, hundreds of thousands of people are going to be picking up that Bible and trying to read parts of that Bible, hoping, can we learn something more about this? The end.